Hey guys, you're listening to Metal Matters, a weekly gimme radio podcast. I'm your host, Mike Hill. If you like metal, punk, hardcore, or anything extreme, you've come to the right place. So subscribe and never miss out. Welcome back, guys. I'm not sure how many of you caught the first time around that Dwid was a guest, but it was during the Psycho Las Vegas weekend, and the conditions in which we spoke were, let's say, less than ideal. Bad phone connection, an economy of time, that kind of thing. So, it's with a great pleasure that I have Dwid Hellion back on the show. A way more relaxed environment. We talked about a bunch of really cool stuff, and it was a pleasure. And as most of you know, I've been a fan of Integrity and all of the related side projects. So here we go. Integrity has a very distinct visual aesthetic, and what I'm speaking about primarily is that skull image. Like just the other day, I was wearing my long sleeve Integrity shirt, and in Midtown Manhattan, I was like, yeah, this definitely brands me as a certain type of person. Where did that skull image come from? Because I know you have an extensive background doing visual art.
When I was a kid, I still am a big fan of Danzig and the Misfits and Sam Hain and that sort of thing. And I remember reading an interview with Glenn, and someone had asked him where he came up with the skull that they used for Danzig and for Sam Hain. And he said that it was originally drawn in a Christar comic. And I'm not a big fan of Christar, but I thought that was an interesting approach. And when the time came for me to come up with a logo for my band, I remembered that story. And I had been reading a comic that Kent Williams had drawn or had painted. It was a graphic novel that at that time they were crossing from just pen and ink and doing more experimental stuff and painting and different things like that, collage. And this comic was called Blood a Tale, and there's a painting somewhere located in there, in some of the versions, that has this portrait of the vampire, and I redrew in high contrast black and white style my rendition of that painting, just the head. And then I redrew it over and over again over the years, because back then, I didn't have computers or files or any USB sticks to store the stuff on. So when I'd lose it, I just have to redraw it from memory or whatever. And so it evolved into what it is now. I think it's probably changed over the years to some degree, but that's basically how it came to be. I have a side story about it too, which is pretty funny. You may know the record we did called Humanity is the Devil.
Yes. And
Pusshead is the artist who did the cover art for that record. And the first time I met Pusshead in person, we used to be pen pals and that type of thing in the 80s and early 90s. And I met him in person in mid-90s or something like that out in San Francisco where he was living. And he said, I got something funny to tell you. That skull that you use, that's taken from that Blood a Tale, right? I said, yeah, it is. He goes, the original painting of that by Kent Williams is hanging over my bed. I own that painting.
Oh, wow, man.
So that was a pretty cool coincidence.
That was part of the Epic imprint, right, that Marvel did, like I think in the 80s, the Blood comic, the miniseries.
I think so, yeah. It was Epic.
Yeah.
And I think the writer's name was DeMatteis.
Yes.
I'm probably butchering his name.
Yeah, J.M. DeMatteis or DeMatteis.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, that was cool. That was I remember that was the beginning of major companies like Marvel and then later DC with Vertigo kind of delving into the more quote unquote adult sort of side of storytelling. And that Blood comic was really cool. It was like a mini series, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, it started out as four books, and then they compiled it as one graphic novel later on.
Did you ever check out the Epic magazine, which was Marvel's answer to heavy metal?
No, I don't think I did. If I did, I don't remember.
I'll make one recommendation here. There's the first, I think, like 9 or 10 issues. It was basically followed the same format that heavy metal did, where there was like different stories, different serializations of longer forms. And there was this one particular Jim Starlin story that started in issue number 1, and it was called the Metamorphosis Odyssey. And yeah, it's like one of these cosmic epics that later was sort of the origin story for the Starlin character Dreadstar, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with.
Yeah.
But somewhere it's probably collected into a graphic novel, and that's like I've reread that several times over the years. It's really good. Your involvement with art, that started at a very young age, or did what were the beginnings of that? Because that's something I always found fascinating about Integrity, is like, which I mentioned earlier, was this very strong visual aesthetic, and some of the bands that I was attracted to earlier on, such as Black Flag, and there was the Misfits, Sam Hain, Danzig, that sort of stuff. It seems that you also were drawn into that through art.
Yeah, that art was what first would spark the interest in a record for me, because back then you didn't have much to go on. You go into a record store, there also wasn't a lot of bands, and in the record stores that you'd go to, there would be a very slim chance of finding something that was loud or extreme. Most of it would be, Phil Collins or Huey Lewis or something. But in the section that would be considered punk or heavy metal, you'd have a very, very limited amount of choices. So I would base it off of what the album art cover looked like. And if it intrigued me, and I thought that there was a story underneath that could be told with the music, then I would take my chances. And sometimes it would pay off, sometimes it wouldn't pay off. You asked about how I got into art. That started because I grew up in Indiana on a farm, and back then you didn't have the internet, you didn't have anything. I had a shared phone line with the whole street. So in other words, like, if I needed to use the telephone, I could pick it up. Sometimes it would be at the farm like 2 miles down the street. They're using it, talking to their relatives or something, and I'd have to say, "Oh, excuse me, I'll use it later." And then when they would be done with their call and hang it up, the phone would make a special ring kind of sound, and you'd know that you could then use the phone. It was like a community phone line because it was out in the middle of nowhere, and it was the 70s. So because of that, because of the limited inputs that I had for my creativity or for just being a kid, I started drawing and coming up with my own universes and where I wanted to be and what I thought would be entertaining to look at or to visit or to imagine. And I guess in that sense, because I was isolated, I used that opportunity. I didn't think about it this way, but I just accidentally used that opportunity to develop my imagination.
People that are born after a certain year are not even going to be able to relate to, man. And
yeah,
that's pretty interesting.
I figure.
One of the things that I think about all the time is all this 24/7 access that everyone has doesn't prompt people to just sort of sit with their thoughts. Prior to the internet, prior to cell phones, you had a time when you can actually be alone and have thoughts without being bombarded by advertising and people texting you wanting to find out where you're at, and notifications from Facebook and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sometimes I'll get lucky and I'll be in a place where internet is not available, but because I have a European residence, my cell phone is European. Sometimes when I travel to the States for concerts, I'll be in limbo without any kind of service, and it's kind of a nice break.
You moved around quite a bit earlier on, because I think you ended up, there's one particular town you lived in that had some really interesting stuff happen. So before you ended up in Cleveland, you moved around quite a bit, I think, right?
Yeah, from Indiana, my parents got divorced, and I ended up going with my father, and my father remarried, and we ended up in Louisville, Kentucky for a while. I also lived in Anna Maria Island, Florida, which is near Sarasota, I guess. It's the closest bigger city, Bradenton maybe. But I lived there briefly. But I lived in Louisville, Kentucky. That's where I learned about punk rock and heavy metal music through skateboarding. I started skateboarding. I think this would be 83 and 84. And then through skateboarding, other kids had dubbed cassette tapes that they would share with each other. Back then you would buy a vinyl record, and then you have a cassette deck, and you'd make copies of your favorite songs or your favorite albums, and you could trade it to a friend. I guess like a mixtape, they'd say now, where you send MP3s to a friend. And then I got turned on to a lot of different music at that point. There was my parents, they're very, very religious, and they ended up having this house that was not on the property of the church, but it was behind the church's property. So in other words, like the lot behind the church would be, it was in a subdivision in a neighborhood, but the church was in the middle of the neighborhood, and then at the end of that, their property began, this other street, which happened to be my house was on that street, and my house was the house right behind it. And with a lot of churches, they often have those other parts where you can rent it out, have a wedding, or have a birthday party, or have some kind of celebration, somebody's anniversary, or whatever. And the older local kids in the town had booked Sam Hain. This would be 84, 85, I think. And they booked Sam Hain on, I think, the first tour that they did. And the older boys, their band was named Maurice. And later on, those guys they split up, and they became two different bands. Slint was one, and the other one was King Horse. I don't know if you're familiar with either of those guys.
Yeah, definitely.
But, yeah.
Definitely Slint. More so Slint than King Horse, but yeah.
Danzig actually produced the King Horse album. It was on Caroline. It's a good record.
Now you mentioned that the church was sort of this prominent location in your neighborhood, and did religion and Christianity, was that, and this is the Midwest too, so was that like a heavy sort of was there like a religious sort of thing going on when you were growing up?
Oh yeah, my parents were very, very religious, and to the point of it being a problem almost. And so that was always ingrained in me. Also, my other relatives, they were all into religion and very far into it. And I think that definitely put its hooks into me, into how I saw the world, because of always being told about these eternal punishments and such. And it was ingrained in who I am. I think that the first movie that I ever saw as a kid also has a religious theme. It's a movie called Bedazzled, and I had this severely small TV set, and my parents thought I was asleep, and I turned it on, and this show just happened to be on as a late night movie, and I watched it, and it's basically like a Faustian tale about the devil tempting this guy who's a bit of a loser, who wanted to kill himself because he couldn't get a date with this girl, and the devil tricks him into selling his soul to him and trading his soul to him in exchange for some wishes. And every time that the guy's wishes would come true, the devil would swoop in to knock his feet out from under him and screw it up somehow. And so that was also a big part of my upbringing, because that somehow really made an impact on me.
Like, at what point did you decide or have this sort of idea that there was like a bigger picture available to any kind of belief like that, belief systems?
To belief systems. Well, I remember when I lived in Indiana, I remember looking out over the cornfields as a really small kid and thinking, there's got to be more to the world than this. But at that point, as far as I could see it to the horizon, was just flat cornfields and barns, and I didn't imagine there could be much further than that. Obviously there was, but then as I moved to different places and met different people, I think that probably with the religious mind expansion would be because of an unlikely source would be because of the Satanic Panic, which I don't know if you know what that is, or if your
definitely
listeners know. In the 80s, there was this idea that the devil was around every corner, and he was in music, and he was in books, and he was in everything, and you better watch out because he's going to get you. And he was doing all these things, and I thought to myself, is he really doing these things? And I wondered about that a lot, to the point of it becoming almost a problem for me as well. And then I would try to research things like that, and that's how I came across discovering the Process Church, by trying to find out, is there really something like this? Is there truly a group of devil worshipping maniacs out there who are just trying to fucking ruin the world? And that's how I came to that thing. But as far as opening my mind, I guess that the Satanic Panic made me think, hey, that's out there. What else is out there? And then I started reading more books and finding out about different things. And back then it wasn't really easy to get books on unusual topics, especially unpopular topics like that. As you said, in the 80s, I think everybody was some derivative of Christian, or at least they portrayed themselves as being such. And if you weren't, or you said you weren't, then you were like a pariah of society. And if you wore, like if you wore a Misfits shirt or whatever, then you were considered a crazy outlaw in society. People would try to attack you on the streets, and it was quite a wild situation.
In the 80s, though, man, there was some of my favorite stories was the favorite, but I remember the Ricky Casso, the Long Island, that story that actually Jim Van Bever made that short film about, My Sweet Satan. I was like in high school, I think, when that all happened, and it was like in my living room, there was like this satanic cult on Long Island, which was like an hour and a half away from where I was at that moment, murdering people and listening to heavy metal music. You're probably familiar with that story.
Yeah. Also, DeGrimston, he lives in Long Island.
Staten Island, actually.
Is it Staten?
He's in the phone book. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for those of the listeners out there who aren't familiar with the Process Church, like some of the imagery that I saw earlier on with integrity, like the 4 pi symbol, like all that sort of stuff. A lot of those symbols were inspired or sort of part of that ideology. So,
well, the Process Church were probably the most highly visible, even though they tried to be discreet. They were the most highly visible religious organization in the 60s and 70s that would promote Satanism. But at the same time, they promoted. They had 4 parts to it. So they had a Jehovian part, a Luciferian part, a Christian Jesus Christ part, and then they had a satanic part. And the idea, I guess, would be that Jehovah's son is Jesus, and Satan's son is Lucifer, and this sort of like duality that works together, this sort of yin and yang. But at the same time, the idea of it was that these archetypes represent certain attributes that you would possess as a person, and you could go to their congregation and you would identify yourself with specific aspects of each of those 4 characters, so those 4 archetypes. So you may be someone who's brutal, and you like to fight, and you like to raise hell, and at the same time you're a bit of a trickster, and but then you're also judgmental. So then you'd be like, in that order, you'd have a portion of you would be under the satanic side, another portion would be the Luciferian, and the judging would be Jehovian. And it just really depends on what your personal attributes would connect with. It's each person had their own different balance of that. And that was kind of the whole concept of it, I guess, if you wanted to make it very simple and plain explaining.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because that ideology is something that if you considered yourself part of the world, but you also were on the outside of the world, that accounting for the different attributes of your personality, I think, is like without. And actually, there isn't really. I mean, I guess you could take it as like a religious context, but more of just like this kind of archetypical representation of the different facets of one's personality. You know, like you could easily relate to that by putting different names on it. It doesn't have to be Satan, you know, Jesus,
Exactly.
Jehovah. You know, it's almost like in Dungeons and Dragons where you're like, you know, chaotic, good, or evil. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah,
to like lighten it a little bit,
exactly.
make it more relatable.
I think that they used those characters because they were the most popular characters at the time for that type of thing, and obviously the Satan side caused them a lot of grief in the long run. But there's an interesting lineage to how this whole thing progressed, if you want to know. So Aleister Crowley, he had later on in life, he had followers all throughout the world, and one of his followers out in California was a guy named Jack Parsons. And
Yeah.
Jack is the guy who invented rocket fuel for uh, for flying jets and for flying rockets into space. And he had quite a bit of money from that, and he had this real big house, and he would have his meetings there, teaching the philosophies and religion of Crowley to 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 his followers. And there was what the equivalent of like a Comic-Con at the time for what would be science fiction writers, and he was a big fan of science fiction writers. He went to this Comic-Con type thing, and he met his favorite author, whose name is L. Ron Hubbard. And he invited Ron back to his house with him and said, hey, I got a nice place. You can come and stay with me for a while. I can teach you about this stuff. It's probably interesting. Maybe you could even use it in one of your novels in the future. And this, beautiful women, and it's going to be great. I would assume that probably a sci-fi writer at that time in American history probably wasn't fighting off the ladies, and probably was quite the lonely guy. So he jumped at the chance, and so Parsons taught Hubbard everything he knew about Crowley and Crowley's teachings, and then there's a lot of little things involved, and I'll just jump around a bit. But basically, Hubbard used that, and he created Scientology. Scientology became rather popular, and these two this British couple out in London, who Robert de Grimston and Mary Ann, decided that they were going to join this Scientology thing. They joined that, and they used aspects of that and created the process. So it sort of all goes down to Crowley in the end of in the family tree of all of that.
Yeah, because there's some detractors out there who are like, oh, well, the Process Church is like, they throw that Scientology, term around because of, just the controversy that's around Scientology these days. Yeah.
Well, the Process Church doesn't exist. It hasn't existed for a long, long, long time.
Right.
So
exactly.
I don't know if anyone's, if anything, they would probably deny any of that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, they even denied that they had any affiliation with Charles Manson, except for their magazine that they would publish had two interviews with Charles Manson at a time where you couldn't really get an interview with Charles Manson. And they just said, oh, that's a coincidence. Because, everybody accidentally is interviewing Charlie. That's just, oops, shit, there's another interview with that old Charlie. He just can't stop but be interviewed with us here, So, they tried to clean up their image quite a bit. And
there's two really good books out there, too. There's was a Strange Angel about with Jack Parsons. It's like a Jack book about,
that's a Feral House.
Feral House, yeah. And then I think Feral House also did Process Church. Was it Love sex, death, something like that.
They did a few things. The one you're talking about, I believe, is the one that's the collection of the magazines.
Yeah.
Then they also did. Well, no, they did a collection of the magazines called Propaganda.
Yes.
And then they did the Love, Sex, Fear, Death, which is sort of like Cliff Notes, I guess, or something like just like the basics. Like here's what it's like. Here's some excerpts.
Yeah, it was. Well, it was more like accounts of former members, and I think.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah, and not Douglas. Genesis Peorage wrote like the forward to it, and it's actually pretty cool. And they refer, that's where I found out that De Grimston lives out in Staten Island, because that's in the preface to the book and all that.
Yeah, he works for AT&T. Yeah, I have that book. Yeah. I have also the Bainbridge book, Satan's Power, and I have Hand of Death. I have I'm looking at my bookshelf right now, so I can see all these things, so I know what I'm talking about to some degree. Also, Farrell House did the book Sex and Rockets, which is another Parsons.
Yeah, I got to check that one out. Actually, I haven't read that one.
Yeah.
So Cleveland.
One of those they made a TV show about. So.
Oh yeah, yes. I think it's called Strange Angel. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably probably that book.
Yeah. Integrity is like kind of the quintessential Cleveland hardcore band. So, at least in my reckoning, when did you get to Cleveland? How did you meet all of the original members? That kind of thing. Like, what was the vibe like?
When I was 16, I think, my parents moved to Cleveland because of my stepmother's job. Had her moving a bit, so she relocated, and I ended up living in this suburb of Cleveland called Minter, and we moved in, and I got my skateboard, and I went to ride down the driveway to see what I could find on the first day, and there was this van across the street at the girl across the street's driveway with spray paint on it, and punk symbols and stuff, and some guys hanging out around there. So I went and talked to them, and they were guys that were in a band called Confront. I don't know if you've heard of that.
I'm familiar with the band, yes.
Yeah, that was a hardcore group, and they had a different singer at that time, the original singer, who wrote all the songs, all the lyrics, named Jerry Beck. And I became friends with those guys, and through them I became, and through other, my school and stuff, I met other kids that were into stuff. Because back then, if you had any kind of, even if you had Vans shoes, as weird as it sounds, if you wore Vans shoes, and you went into the shopping mall, or you were at the grocery store with your grandma or something, and somebody else had Vans shoes, you'd look at them and say, what kind of music are you into? And then somehow you'd probably have something in common with them. And that was kind of how you met people back then. That sounds crazy, I guess, but that's kind of how it was. My first band I had was called Die Hard. But at the same time, simultaneously, I had made Integrity shirts and stickers, and I'd been trying to figure out how I was going to do that, but I fell into this other thing called Die Hard, which was really basic hardcore type stuff, except for the song Judgment Day, which carried on into Integrity. Yeah, well, because of those guys I had mentioned earlier, Confront, who I'd met, they were going to do some concerts. I don't remember where it was, some concert somewhere. And they said, hey, maybe you can roadie for us, which basically meant I'd carry stuff. And I said, yeah, that would be cool. And the bass player, he lived in Cleveland Heights, which was on the other side of, closer to the city. And his neighbor was Aaron Melnick, and he had asked him to also roadie. So we rode up together, and someone in the van said, hey, this guy plays bass. Aaron plays bass. Maybe you guys should start a band together. And so we said, okay, well, we should. So we started Die Hard together at that time. And then after a bit of time, they were unhappy with what I was bringing. They didn't like the lyrics or the vocals or any of that. So they fired me. And like I said, I had done those shirts and stickers of integrity, and I've been trying to think of how I was going to do that. And at my school, I was taking art classes and printmaking classes, and I knew how to do screen printing, printing of shirts and printing of stickers. And so I was making these integrity T-shirts, and whenever bands would come into town that I was friends with, I'd say, "Hey, you want a shirt?" And I'd give it to them, things like that. So Gorilla Biscuits had come through town in 1988, and I was friends with Walter and some of the other guys. And I gave them some shirts, and I don't know if Walter was wearing the shirt or something happened, but the next date after the Cleveland date was a Chicago date, and Tony Brummel, who's the guy who owns Victory Records, at that time he was just starting his label. I'm not sure if he had any records out or if he had maybe one or two out, but he asked Walter if he could do the Gorilla Biscuits LP. At that time, they had only had a 7-inch. And Walter said, thanks for the offer, but we already have an agreement with Revelation Records. Mm-hmm. But, my friend in Cleveland, his name is Dwid, and he had this band Integrity. And somebody had the shirt on. I don't know if it was Walter or someone else. But he said, oh, here's the shirt and whatever. And so then Tony said, oh, wow, this sounds like a promising group, I guess. So I got a phone call at this point. I was living in a house with a lot of other like musician type punk people. I don't know if that still goes on, but back then you'd have a whole lot of people living in one house, and it would be kind of like almost a flop house. And you had one phone stuck to the wall because there wasn't cell phones invented yet, and or if it was invented, it was outside of our means. And you'd get a phone call, and you'd be out, and somebody would write it on a paper next to the phone, and you'd see that. And so someone said, "Yeah, this record company called for you," and I was like, "Yeah, sure, fuck off," But then it turned out to be true. So I called the guy back, and he said, "Yeah, can you send me a demo?" And I said, "Well, I don't have any money for no demos, but I'll see what I can do." And he said, "Well, I'll send you a little bit of money, and you guys can go in the studio and record a few songs." So I came up with a song using like a little bit of reverse engineering of other songs that I liked, and also like beatboxing, sort of, just using my mouth as the drums and hitting things and making sound that way, to come up with a song called "Live It Down." And so I had that going for me, and word spread pretty quickly. And this girl that I knew, this was around Christmas time, I guess, so shortly after Christmas. So this would be like 89 at this point. And early, in the winter, like January or something. And this girl that I knew had gotten a guitar. It's called a JB Player from her parents for Christmas, and it's a toy guitar that they sold at Toys R Us. So it's a smaller scale. And she said, "Oh, I heard you got signed for a record, and I know you don't have a band or anything, so here you can have this guitar. Maybe it'll help you." I said, "Oh, thanks." So then almost the same day or the next day, Aaron called me and said, "Hey, sorry that we fired you from Die Hard, but we heard you had a record deal, and I'd love to be a part of it." And I said, "Yeah, okay." And he said, "But I want to play guitar." And I said, "Funny that you mentioned you want to play guitar. This girl just gave me a guitar. Do you have a guitar?" He's like, "I don't have a guitar. I have a bass." So he came over and he got the guitar, and he's a smaller guy. And so the smaller guitar really worked well for him, I think. It just seemed to be, the universe was smiling on us at that moment, and the guitar really fit him very well. And so I said, "This is the idea that I have. What do you think?" And then he worked on that, and then we got Tom, who was in Confront, to play bass. And then we got this other guy to play drums, which I'm not so pleased about that, but we recorded the demo. We sent it to Victory. They liked it. They said, "Maybe you could record these songs better." and do a 7-inch. And we thought, wow, a 7-inch, that's insane. So we went into a recording studio, and we did the 7-inch.
It's fascinating, honestly, about
Really?
because the other thing that comes to mind is that the band Scratch Acid was a band that existed in name and on stickers and T-shirts before there was actually a lineup.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so
Then
it's kind of
I'm
like
not alone.
no, you're not. That's what I mean. I'm like, oh, this sounds just like a story I heard about Scratch Acid. So
Yeah, I like Scratch Acid.
yeah,
So I didn't know that about them. And Jesus Lizard, I like. Nowadays, you can record in your phone. You can record on your computer. It's easy. Maybe your friend even has a nice setup. But back then, it was like impossible to record anywhere. And we happened to know these guys that were in glam rock bands that would just do basically cover songs of Poison and Bon Jovi and stuff. And they would go, there was like a scene of those kinds of bands, and they would all go to this really small, inexpensive new studio and record their demos there. And what they'd do is they'd record covers of Bon Jovi and stuff, and then they'd sell tapes at their shows for their fans. And they said you could go there and record. So we went there, and the guy was like, okay, what kind of music do you guys play? And we were like, yeah, well, it's we tried to explain it. He didn't really understand it. So we played some tapes and things, and he said, why do you want to make that? You could make something like on the radio. You have a record deal. This is your big shot. I said, yeah, this is what we want to make. We're not able to do what, Phil Collins or something, or even if we were able to, we're not able to creatively. We're not able to do that. So eventually, through a lot of tug of war with the studio, we were able to pull that out, the demo and then the 7-inch, and we did record a couple albums with the same guy as well. But back then, it was really difficult to get into a recording studio, and it was pretty expensive to do as well. But this place was less expensive than the rest. So.
Yeah, because back then you had to buy tape, which was not cheap. It's not like now where you just have to show up with a hard drive or something,
Right, yeah. You had to buy a reel-to-reel tape.
Yeah, that stuff was very expensive, actually, especially if you're a bunch of guys living in a house together and, kind of trying to make it happen,
But, the good thing about that tape, and believe it or not, that tape holds up.
Yeah.
I had just 6 months ago, I had the Those Who Fear Tomorrow reels converted to digital, and it was perfect. It was crazy how perfect it sounded when it got converted. I thought it was going to sound like, it'd been underwater, or I don't know what it would sound. I thought it would sound terrible, but it sounds perfect.
There was like a few bands that come, like when I think of Integrity, I think of Ringworm, I think of in Cold Blood, I had Blaze on as a guest a while back, and the term Holy Terror gets thrown around, and when I was talking to Blaze, I asked him about this, and he's like, well, that's something that Dwid came up with, that term. So what's that term? Like, is there any significance to that? Is there sort of any connection between these bands besides sharing members? And
I can't speak for them for what they want to associate their music with, but I can say that from talking to them, Ringworm and Cold Blood, they don't want any connection with that kind of title. They don't associate with that Holy Terror thing. Holy Terror came about because there was a magazine called Inside Front, which was ran by Brian from the band Catharsis. Do you remember that?
Yeah, they were great, man. And
so Brian had a zine, and he wanted to describe this kind of music, but yeah, this is a very complicated thing, because it seems like lately I have this conversation a lot. So when our first album came out, it would be like 91. We recorded it in like late 90, I think, and it came out in 91. And it was, people said it was too heavy metal to be hardcore, and too hardcore to be heavy metal, and too metal to be punk, and too everything to be the other thing. So we were sort of a band without a genre, which I think is a good thing. But unfortunately, most people their heads start to smoke when they find out, oh my God, it doesn't fit into that box. I don't know what to do. So at that time, hardcore had changed from the hardcore that I had grown up with, and it was only not that long, maybe not even 10 years had I been into it, but it had changed dramatically as far as what the definition of it meant. Originally, what I knew it to mean was it was punk and metal together. So sometimes you're more punk and sometimes you're more metal, but basically like that. But you could throw other things in there too, and that's still okay. Like you said before, Black Flag and bands like that. So you had this different thing, and people were doing their own thing, and it was considered hardcore because it wasn't necessarily just punk, but it also wasn't necessarily heavy metal. And so that's kind of what we thought we were, but I guess we weren't that either, because once reviews came out for the album, all the people who were into hardcore music said, oh, this is not hardcore, this is heavy metal, this sucks, this is glam rock, this is all kinds of different things. So we said, okay, whatever, who cares what genre it is, we like to play this music because we like it, that's all. And if it doesn't fit into people's proper category, I don't care. So we just continued to do it. But at the same time, Brian from Inside Front, he wanted to find a way to say that it didn't sound like the typical hardcore sound, which is usually like I'm living without a home, my gang is going to fight your gang, and also you're not allowed to eat this, but I'm allowed to eat some things, but you're not allowed to eat that. And if you eat that, then I'm not your friend, so I'm mad about what's in your refrigerator, that kind of thing. And that was sort of what was the main thing at that time. So we didn't really fit that. And so he said, you guys sing a lot about apocalyptic imagery and the end of the world and this kind of religious thing and the fervor of serial killers purging the earth and things like this. So I think of it as like holy terror, like a terrorism of religion or something. And it could be considered to be anti-religious, or it could be considered like inquisitory religious, where it's so religious that it's out to impose on other people, I guess. So that term came about because of Brian. And I thought, well, that makes more sense than the other thing about, topics that we don't have anything in common with, really. And, early on, we did try to, when we were all young, we were not drinking because we were kids. And even though the funny thing was that, at least from Aaron and I, we both had drinking problems. Aaron was in AA when he was a kid. And so that's why he was straight or whatever. And I had a lot of problems too. And so I was straight because of that, and also because I lived at some point in the suburbs where you couldn't just go into liquor stores and buy drinks until you move into the big city. Then all bets are off. So there was a little bit of that on the very first demo. We had songs about diets and what's in your refrigerator. But after that, when the first album came out, that was where we sort of knew what we were really doing and what we wanted to do. And I think that the sound was there on the demo on the 7-inch, but the vision wasn't exactly right yet. And when the first album, Those Who Fear Tomorrow, came out, then we sort of found the direction where everything was working correctly, like the artwork and the lyrics and the music and the fact that the songs were all different from each other. It wasn't that one song that they weren't all the same song over and over again, like 12 of the same song, but it would be 12 totally different songs that none of them really made sense together, but somehow it kind of made sense for some people. So
yeah, well that kind of bandwidth of material, I think, and that sort of idea of trying to move forward and have not just these kind of rote lyrics is what kept the band interesting all these years. You know what I mean? I mean, even there's different eras of integrity, but what happens a lot of times with bands that have been around for like 20 years, as a fan, I kind of discount their last few records because they're not as good as the earlier records. You know what I mean? And there's two exceptions. One of them is integrity, because the last few records that came out. I think I actually listen to those records more than like Humanity is the Devil. And
Thanks.
the other band is the brand new Cro-Mag stuff that came out is awesome. I don't know if you've heard that stuff yet.
I heard one song.
Yeah.
I can't remember what it was called though.
Yeah, it's just it's a 7-inch that came out incidentally on Victory. And
oh yeah, it's on Victory too. That's right. Yeah. Harley's a nice guy. Yeah, it's good that he's doing stuff.
Oh, totally. You know, so the new sort of era of the band is well, there was a little bit of a lull, I think, in the career of the band, and then these guys put this newer lineup together and came out with almost like a more black metal kind of vibe, but yet it still has that root in punk music and hardcore.
Which record are you meaning?
Well, I'm talking about like, you know, all the way back to like the Black Curse. Like that record is, to me, is like sort of the beginning of like, I mean, in my opinion, I mean, I don't know how you see it, but it's like for me, in my opinion, that's kind of like a division, like a new point of like where things started changing, I think, sonically for the band.
Yeah, technology started to become, to catch up with where I always hoped that it would get for the band, because like we said before, it's really expensive to record in the studios and everything. And then at that point, when that record, and we had a single out shortly before that called Valpurgisnacht. And at that point, we were able to mix between studio and home recording. So you could get a lot more done, and you could experiment more, and you didn't really have to worry about the clock ticking with the money counting up and running out too fast. So I was able to spend more time on the music, spend more time on the ideas, and take more chances because I had the things at my fingertips, the tools at my fingertips to allow me to do that. And slowly it got into that rhythm of being able to record a lot of it on home equipment and then send it back to somebody else, and then that person would do their thing and then build upon it that way, which is where it is now, where we can do a lot of it at home and perfect it the way we like, and or scrap it or cut it up and change it, and do whatever you want.
Yeah, that's a huge tool that people have these days, especially a lot of times bands live in different states, or in your case, different countries.
Yeah.
And
my
more
education
recently
was in collage, so I apply that to music. So if you're not familiar with collage, or if your audience is not familiar with collage is where you take images from newspapers or magazines and cut out different parts of it, and then montage it together and make new images, new art out of found pieces of imagery. And the concept of that, taking pieces and moving them around, that's kind of how I understand music. That's how I see it, at least. And so whenever I'm working on things, I can say, okay, I take this chunk and I move it here. What if I put this here? And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't work. And then sometimes you can make it work. And sometimes when it doesn't work, it inspires you for something totally new that you create from that point. And that gives a fresh idea, I think, because I don't know anybody else who usually goes that direction. So that perspective allows a lot of freedom, and a lot of probably what a lot of people would call mistakes to occur. And sometimes the mistakes are the great aspects of what I do with integrity.
What comes to mind is the name Brian Geisen. Are you familiar with that guy?
Yeah, of course, Brian Geisen, yeah.
Geisen, yeah.
I'm probably saying it wrong. But actually, he wasn't the first. It was Tristan Tzara and Andre Breton. A lot of people attribute Burroughs and Brian Geisen, or Geisen, as being the inventors of cut-up, which for your listeners, is the idea of collage as words, poetry collage, I guess. But the original people to do that was Andre Breton and Tristan Tzara of the Dada movement in Zurich, Switzerland. And what they did was they had this performance where they took a hat, at the time when people wore those big hats, they took the took off one of these big hats, and they cut out the newspaper clippings from probably about the First World War, put it all into a hat, and then just started reading out words, pulling out the word, reading it, throwing it, reading it, throwing it, reading it, throwing it, and the juxtaposition of those words together, forming visuals in the mind of the audience, drove the audience into a fury, and they started to fight each other. And in a way, that was the first punk concert. They started to fight each other, and the presenter and everybody. It broke out into a riot, and that was, in my opinion, how underground music sort of began. That was the very first mosh pit.
Yeah. More recently, in the very recent past, you guys played at Las Vegas, Psycho Las Vegas, and
Yeah.
how was that?
That was great. It's always great. We played it a couple of times, and
Yeah.
it's a lot of fun. And the only downside to it is that I end up knowing too many of the people that are involved in it, and then I end up talking to everybody, and I never get to see any bands. I'll head to this. Oh, this band is playing in half an hour at this stage, and I'll start walking there. I'll run into somebody, talk to them for 10 minutes, and then 5 feet later, I run into another guy, and next thing you know, that show's over. So that's, but it's also a great thing to see old friends as well. So.
A few years ago, you guys played at Roadburn, I think, right?
Yeah. That's
like,
not too far from my house.
Yeah. And you live in Belgium now, right? And
yeah, I live in Belgium.
And that probably is one of my favorite festivals, just because of the way it's curated. I think is really cool. I mean, there's a lot of variety of different bands that play that, and it's cool that Integrity played, but then also like you'll get a band that's completely different. Like,
I have a funny Roadburn story if you want to hear it.
Sure.
I have a friend who's in a band called Amin Ra. They live in the city that I live in. Do you know who they are?
I do. I know Colin very well, actually.
Yeah, Colin. He's my friend, and he and his kids come to my house for Halloween because my neighborhood's the only one that has Halloween around here. So I put on Halloween in my neighborhood, so they come for that. Anyway, he was asked to do his solo performance at the Roadburn. And I convinced him to. He and I had just done a collaborative recording together I had this project called Vermipure, where I made homemade instruments, and sort of, it's not really black metal, but kind of in that world of rough guitar metal, but made with homemade guitars and kind of like junk. Almost not cigar boxes, but looking like that, like the old blues. The idea was to take the old Delta blues and fuse it together with the French black metal stuff from the or from the mid 90s called the Legions Noir. And so he and I did this collaboration show together, and it was at Roadburn. And my favorite band growing up was is Gizem from Japan.
Oh yeah.
And so part of the reason I was like, please let us do this collaborative together was because I would get an opportunity to play with Gizem, which was my childhood dream. And after we got done playing our set, I went to put my equipment away. And at Roadburn, there's this big garage where you can store your equipment and then go off and see the concerts. So I stored my equipment, and one of the security guys said, hey, are you here to see that Japanese band? And I said, yeah, actually I am. And he said, oh, you just go through that door right there, and that's where it is. So I thought that was where the general public could go in. So I walked through this curtain. I pushed the curtain aside, and I was with my friend JP and my wife Stephanie. And we walked through, opened the curtain, and there I'm face to face with Sakevi of Gizem. Nice. And my wife and my friend are talking away, and they're not paying any attention, and they don't care. And I'm like, wow, this is fucking Sakevi from Gizem. So I'm talking to him and telling him all these stories, that I have these stories, like it's the first record I bought and all this stuff. And so somehow he knew from these dumb stories, he must have read it on the internet or something. Maybe he searched Gizem, and this redundant story that I always tell popped up somehow, and he read it, and he recognized the dumb story, and he said, oh, "Are you Dwid Hellion?" And I was like, "Oh my God!" And I turned to my wife and my friend, and they're talking away. They don't care, and I'm thinking, "Geez, nobody's experiencing this. No, I have no witness." But yeah, so I got to watch Giesem from the side stage, and I was blown away.
Yeah, it's just cool that there's a festival like that where you could see, all these different varied styles, yet when you take a step back and look at the entire breadth of the festival, there are these weird threads that connect these bands stylistically, you know what I mean? And it's almost like this intangible thing that you can kind of see, oh yeah, this makes sense that Fields of Nephilim played and Giesem played and Integrity, even though on each one on its own has its own separate sort of thing,
Yeah, well, we've had a lot of strange shows with different types of bands. Our first European tour that we ever did was with Neurosis, and that was at the time when Neurosis was transitioning from Alternative Tentacles, which was Jello Biafra's label, and then they went on to join Relapse.
Yeah.
So they were Alternative Tentacles is more known for punk, and Relapse is more known for metal. So it was sort of crossing over at that point with them. And anybody who listens to their music, they have a lot of different influences mixed into their cauldron, and it comes out very original because of that. So that was it was a great tour to do, and that was the type of band that, even though they don't sound anything like us and we don't sound like them, it was a lot of fun to tour with them because we also were interested in weird music that was at the time considered taboo to like Joy Division, for example. We would each do a Joy Division cover in our set dedicated to the other band.
Oh, really? What songs were those that you guys covered?
Well, we would do New Dawn Fades, and I think they did Day of the Lords. And I think that because we would play them heavier, people wouldn't really realize that it was that kind of music, because people frowned on other kinds of music back then. Now people like a lot of different things.
Is there anything on the horizon coming up show-wise for Integrity?
Okay, so November 8th we play Dallas, the 9th we play Denver, the 13th we play Baltimore, the 14th we play Portland, Maine, the 15th Boston, the 16th Quebec, so it's not all America, it's Canada also.
It's North American.
Yeah. And the 17th is Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
And then we have January 5th, we have Tampa. And then there's some other American South shows that are around the Tampa date. The Tampa is a festival called FYA Fest. And I think it just sold out last week. So then we can announce these other shows that we're doing on the way down there.
Right on. Thank you very much for your time. And looking to hopefully catch you guys in the States at some point soon.
Yeah, that would be great.
Right on.
I appreciate you taking the time to interview and ask these questions, and that you care. It's really nice. I appreciate that.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Metal Matters, a Gimme Radio weekly podcast. Tune in next week and see what we have in store for you. The show is available on all streaming platforms, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, etc. Also, be sure to check out Gimme Radio, streaming on the web, iOS, or Android, for one of the best metal communities, exclusive merch, interviews with artists, and so much more. I'll catch you guys next week. Take care.